Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry we're starting just slightly late. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. Today's meeting will focus on small minicab firms in London, and we encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag Assembly Economy and minicabs. We have a few short items of formal business to go through first. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to the silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Arnold and Assembly Member Twycross, for whom Assembly Members Cooper and Assembly Members Eshalomi are substitution, for which I thank you. Declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out at item 2 and ask members if they have any other interest to declare? Can we agree the minutes of our previous meeting on the 17th of January 2019? Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the action taken by me under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the letter to the Mayor regarding self-employed Londoners managing finances under universal credit and note his response to it?
Noted.
Right, thank you. So that now brings us to today's main item for discussion on small minicabs in London. The main focus of the first panel will be to examine the challenges affecting small minicab firms' survival and establish ways that the Mayor can support their survival. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves very, very briefly, if I may. If I can start this side with Steve Wright.
I'm Steve Wright, Chairman of the Licensed Private Hire Car Association and a former TfL board member.
Good morning, my name is Steve Hall. I'm Commercial Director for LCH. We supply exclusive cars to the industry.
I'm Sue Floor, Head of Policy for the British Dyslexia Association. I'm here to represent those dyslexic drivers who have been contacting us about the literacy.
Thank you.
My name is Abu Ashraf Zaman and I'm a PHP driver.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Jameson. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Driver Guide Association. We're a national association of professional Blue Badge tourist guides who undertake tours in their own vehicles.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Welsh. I am the founder and managing director of a company called Small Car Big City. We do sightseeing tours of London in a fleet of restored classic Mini Coopers, so probably one of the more niche operators here today.
I'm Roderick Lynch, former private hire operator and also a consultant on disability transport.
I'm Diana Kendall. I own and run Kendall Cars, a minicab company based in Croydon, and I've been operating for just over 50 years.
Good morning, I'm Zoe Walsh. I'm the Sales and Customer Relations Director at GLH, a London operator that has been running for over 50 years, operates approximately 300 vehicles.
Good morning, Anthony Edwards, Managing Director of Brunel Total Ground Transportation, been operating for over 30 years.
Good morning, I'm Greg Mendoza, Chairman of the Chauffeur and Executive Committee, also Vice President of Kerry International, an operator providing chauffeur drive services in London and globally.
Thank you.
Good morning, I am Jimmy Lazaru. I'm the CEO of Crawfords of London. I also deputise for Greg on the Chauffeur and Executive Committee and the trade rep that meets with TfL. We are at the executive and chauffeur end of the market. We're a licensed operator based in Park Royal with approximately 200 vehicles.
Okay, thank you. And I've just been told that Eddie Townsend was taken ill on the train coming in, so please do send him our best wishes for a speedy recovery. We're going to be asking questions to some of you specifically, but if that is not particularly in your remit, then pass it to anybody that it might concern. So if I start off, aim these firstly to Jimmy Lazaru and Steve Hall. Has it become more difficult to make a living as a minicab operator in recent years, and if so, why?
Sorry, was that to myself, Jimmy Lazaru? Yeah. Okay, so recently TfL have increased the private hire licence operators fees in our bracket. We fall within the 100 to 500 vehicle bracket. So previously, the 5-year operator licence was £2,826, if I'm correct. and we are now faced with a hike to £150,000, which is an absolutely eye-watering 5,207%, if my mathematics are correct. Now, what that means for us is that in an already extremely competitive market, we would have to actually increase our turnover by approximately £600,000 just to be able to stand still and afford the renewal with that sort of hike in fees. The other challenge that we have recently been faced with is the ULEZ and congestion charge. So what usually happens is we renew our fleet approximately every 3 years, and every 3 years the vehicles that we purchase are even greener with lower CO2, more compliant and a lot more efficient. So in December it was announced by TfL that there will be the removal of the congestion charge exemption, and if you had a non-compliant vehicle you'll be faced with a daily charge, and if you had a compliant vehicle, which is now a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, you would be okay. Now, for us to renew our fleet and have plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, we are actually faced with additional manufacturing costs of approximately £2 million in addition, because these vehicles are costing between £9,000 and £14,000 in additional manufacturing costs. The other issue is that, ironically, in October, November, the government grant incentive of the lower end of these vehicles of £2,500 was actually removed. So whilst the congestion charge has come in, the government grant incentives have been removed. So we are faced with these challenges. Now, in London as well, at our end of the market, the people carrier, the MPV as we call it, is predominantly the Mercedes-Benz V-Class and the VW Caravelle. And in fact, these manufacturers do not actually have a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle compliant with this legislation. So even if we wanted to be compliant, there are no vehicles at that end of the market that actually meet with that standard. So that's just a brief summary of some of the challenges that we're challenged with.
And they're real challenges, I should imagine. Steve, have you got anything different to add to that?
No, I think from our point of view, we've been not an operator as a car rental company to the industry. We have challenges administratively, which is going to see probably in the region of 20-25% increase. We don't have to deal with congestion charge today because we supply only exclusively to this industry. So there is additional resource that we're going to have to pull to deal with a lot of the penalty charge notices for this implementation. Just to labour on Jimmy's point is the fact that we also have the same problem in respect of as of 1st January next year. We're not going to be able to purchase about 20% of our fleet because there is no alternative from several manufacturers, the biggest one being the Mercedes V-Class, which is a people carrier, encourages reducing the number of cars impacted by passengers, but that vehicle will not be, or a replacement of that vehicle will not be available till about the end of 2021.
Okay, so you can't be compliant because they don't sell the vehicles.
Correct.
Okay, fine. And as very briefly, if you all had electric vehicles, are there enough electric power points anywhere? No. Okay.
If I may, in 2021, the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle will also be non-compliant because from then on, they're insisting that we have all electric vehicles. So the residual market that I will be looking to sell onto, which are other owner vehicle private hire drivers, that won't be there. And in 2021, approximately 2 years, I'll have to look at renewing the fleet again with, again, additional exorbitant costs.
Okay, fine. What we're going to do is to go through our questions, and with the time left for this little bit, anybody else can go into their comments. Sean.
I'm going to ask comments about the number of minicab firms that are going under. So anybody in particular who is an operator, I'd just like you to give me any indication that you've had that you may go under, and that people in your industry that you're aware of may go under. What sort of numbers are we talking about? 2%, 20% or whatever? Greg, maybe want to start.
So, I mean, TfL's own numbers indicate very clearly that the number of private hire operators in existence is dropping rapidly by tens and 50s in every report. And actually, there's quite a time lag there through discussions with TfL. It's very clear that quite often they don't know that an operator has gone out of business until they go and do an inspection and find that the office is empty and the operator is no longer there. So actually the numbers could be far greater than we're actually seeing in TfL's numbers. As an operator, the additional costs that we've been facing, for my company, we run a fleet of around 150 vehicles, and we've already had the increase in the operator licence fee, as Jimmy said.
How many vehicles do you
150.
have? 150. Yes. Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry.
If you could speak up very slightly, that would
Okay.
be really helpful.
Sure. We've already taken the additional cost of the relicensing, the increase from £2,000 to £150,000, and as of the 8th of April, we have an additional cost of £500,000 a year to cover the congestion charge. Removal of the congestion charge exemption.
So sorry, just to clarify on that, as an operator, you are going to be covering your driver's congestion charge costs?
So we are slightly different at the premium end. We own our vehicles,
okay,
and we employ drivers. So we will be liable for that cost. That cost will clearly have to be passed on to customers to the extent that we can. But the bottom line is that the increase in costs that we face through regulation actually exceed our annual profits. So we've been moved from being a profitable company, unless we can put our prices up, and there's a whole story there about why that's not so easy with the way competition is in London right now. We're moved from being a profitable company to a loss-making company. And that's the case across many operators, and that's what's driving operators out of business today.
Can I ask someone who's not at the premium end, who has a different business model, whose drivers maybe own their cars as opposed to this? Are we seeing operators in that space close down as well?
No.
Please. Can I make a point? All our members are blue badge tourist guides who undertake tours in their own cars. They're all individual, self-employed, sole traders. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't affect the Driver Guides Association as such, but it does affect our members. And in the last year, we have 50 London-based members at the moment. And in the last year, 5 of our members have given up because the costs and the bureaucracy and the stress of offering a driver guide service, they say, just not worth their while. So it's only a very small thing, but we are offering a high-quality bespoke service to tourists. And already we find that the availability of this expert bespoke service is now reducing at quite an alarming rate. So although it doesn't affect us as an operator, it affects our individual members.
So let's just come to you.
Thank you. Around 25% of our fleet are owner drivers, so they're responsible for their own costs. But we are now faced with the situation, if we are unable to cover that cost for them, they may just leave. And so we'll be left with 25% less drivers overnight. So, you know, we're working hard to try and increase customer rates, but as Greg mentioned, that has its own difficulties. But I fear that our fleet is going to become much smaller once the congestion charge is introduced, therefore being able to not cover the work.
And how many vehicles do you have in your fleet?
So we operate both minicabs and couriers. Collectively, there's around 300.
300.
Mm-hmm.
Diane?
And as a smaller operator.
I run between 80 and 100 cars. I work mainly, my core business is SEN transport, community transport and social work. My licence fee at that rate will be at £30,000, up from the £2,800. If I go one driver more, it then leaps to £150,000. I work for the councils. All the councils are hard pressed for cash, and I do not see how we could continue with those kind of fees without passing the cost off. it's an impossible situation. I cannot see us surviving. I've been in business for 50 years and I do not see us making the next couple of years.
Okay, can I just ask one additional question about the residual value of vehicles and the pace at this change? Who can indicate to me the sort of financial stress that may have? Is that a very, very serious thing? It strikes me as it is because of big capital costs, or are we barking up the wrong tree? How impactful would the residual values and the availability of compliant vehicles, how impactful will that be on your businesses?
So, Anthony Edwards. Just to give some clarity and mix the two questions you just asked, we are a 300-strong operator in central London, operating 300 vehicles with a mixture of employed and self-employed drivers.
I really can't hear you again. Sorry, what did you say?
We are a London-based operator with 300 vehicles.
Home-based?
300.
300.
Operating self-employed and employed drivers. And we're also buying 1,400 vehicles today. We actually have on fleets that are for the rental industry. So we're renting vehicles to self-employed drivers. Now, there's no statistics today that tell me what the damaging impact will be, but for sure we definitely have had a concern amongst our base of vehicles and our drivers. This will have a serious damaging effect on our business from the point of view of congestion charging. We'll have to pass the congestion charging costs onto every single driver as part of their rental package.
You're saying only the congestion charge is a concern, not the...
So ULEZ is also a concern. We as a business are sold out 3 years ago to a company called Europcar, and we are purchasing 50,000 vehicles a year within the UK. Now, our buying procurement teams cannot find and source the correct vehicles to make us compliant with both ULEZ and congestion charging. For example, the maximum amount of stock we've been able to find today to replace our existing fleet has been 1,000 vehicles if we could get hold of them. But the demand is so high, we can't.
Okay, thank you, Chair. That's enough of me.
Okay.
Yeah, because you need to roll on.
Right. Andrew just wants to ask some questions.
Yes. I think Anthony and Zoe both mentioned self-employed drivers. Obviously, there's been some recent decisions in the courts over what is and isn't self-employment in this sphere. Can you tell us what control you exercise over the working hours and trips that your drivers do that you classify as self-employed?
Yes, I can answer that. So the guidelines that we work towards are that a driver works an 11-hour shift, 5 days, 6 days a week. And we monitor that through our systems, so we know when they've started and finishing work.
And just to add context for that, from our business point of view, our employed drivers will do a maximum of 10 hours per day on fixed shifts. Our other rental drivers will be self-employed, and they will do a flexible period of working time. So it could be that they could cover between 1 and 4 jobs per day, but there's no necessary requirement on them to do that.
From what Zoe said, it seems to me that you're probably caught by the recent decisions in the tribunals about Uber. How have you approached that?
It's something we've been following over the years, and you know, the line between workers and self-employed. When we've reached out to the fleet, the majority want to be self-employed, so they can come and go as they wish. They don't have to do those 11 hours. That's just a safety aspect, so that they're not working longer than that on the road. But they're free to come and go as they wish, which most of them...
Do you give those drivers holiday pay and so forth?
We don't at the moment.
Okay. Do you pay the London living wage?
We do.
Anthony?
Yes, correct. So we're working with large corporations, for example, the banking industry, law firms, and we're expecting to make sure that our drivers are well paid for the hours they do.
Yeah. And Jimmy, I mean, I thought you were looking at small firms, but in fact, I would have suggested that 500 cars is not a small firm.
No, 200 cars.
I thought you said 5. I thought
we
you said
fall within the licensing bracket of 101 to
right.
500 vehicles, but we have 200
so you've
vehicles.
Got 200?
Yes.
Okay, so same questions to you.
Yeah.
Do you consider your drivers self-employed or employed?
At this present moment in time, all our drivers are self-employed.
Okay, and have you looked at the decisions in the recent litigation?
We are closely monitoring it. We're looking now with our solicitors, our HR teams, to see if, you know, going forward, our current business model will remain or not, as the case may be. But what we do find is the general consensus of drivers prefer the self-employed over the employed, purely for reasons of flexibility and being in control of how they wish to operate.
Do you pay holiday pay, sick pay?
We do not at the moment.
Okay, and do you pay the London Living Wage?
Yes, we do.
Okay. All right. Caroline's going to ask some questions now that deviate from what we were going to ask, because we must be mindful of the fact that there is a court case going on regarding the congestion charge. So we'll steer clear of anything to do with that court case. Caroline.
Yes, I'd like to ask Abu a question. And I gather you are a licensed private hire driver.
Yes.
Which operator do you work for?
I work for Uber.
You work for Uber?
Yes.
And do you, yes, are you expecting that you're going to have to pay the congestion charge when when that comes in, or do you think that they'll...
Yes, I have got a few concerns here. This ullage and congestion charge, it will impact drivers like myself, because most of the drivers are not even earning the minimum wage. So I have calculated in draft that it will cost me approximately £6,000 a year if I work 6 days a week, and I am paying my own taxes to the HMRC. So if I earn after my taxes, say a net of £15,000, and if you take away those £6,000 for ullage and congestion charge, so I will
So are you saying that that's ULEZ and congestion?
And congestion charge.
So when you said £6,000 for the congestion charge, you mean for
No,
both?
£6,000 for both.
It's both?
Yes. If I work...
Because they are different things. They are different things.
Yes, but ultimately I have to pay from my own earning, and it's going to affect me.
£6,000 for both?
Yes, for both. Ullage and congestion charge. If I work 6 days only for 48 weeks. Yeah, and I have a calculation here, and I believe that this is discriminatory and self-defeating, and it will hit those least able to pay. It will have impact on many elderly, vulnerable, disabled passengers, not only in cost, but also availability, because congestion charge zone will become as a no-go area due to the cost. Yes.
I think we're straying a bit into the area of the court case, which I believe we're not able to talk about.
We're really not.
But I am interested that you are so with the ULEZ you are being expected to pay that. Uber are not going to
Guess
help
so.
with
Yes,
that.
yes. So I have to pay from my own earnings this £6,000 a year for both ullage and congestion charge.
And because we're being told we can't talk about the stuff that's in the court case, just in terms of your situation as a worker working for Uber, do you rent a vehicle, or do you own your own vehicle on a hire arrangement?
Yes, thanks. I used to rent, but I found out that it's too expensive to rent. So less than 2 years ago, I bought a diesel car, which is Euro 5 standard. And when I bought my car, nobody informed me that within a couple of years, it will be obsolete. I have to pay the ULEZ charge and congestion charge. I believe that the government or the TfL had a duty to inform us. So I have no other alternative to get rid of my car, but I'm very worried that I will not be able to sell my car, neither I will be able to part exchange it. So it's a total loss for me. I have not yet recovered my cost of my car yet, you know.
Mm-hmm. And are Uber offering any help with leasing alternative vehicles, or?
I have no idea, and I don't think it's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are only limited electric cars available which are out of my reach. I cannot afford to buy those cars.
Mm-hmm.
Even I can take loan from France, these things. There is not enough charging facilities available, neither my home. I drive a lot every day, I hardly see the charging points there. So I'm wondering how I'm going to do this job. You know, I have no other alternative to quit this job and find something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that this is very unfair, you know, and it's nothing but a stealth tax on us. You know.
Can we please correct the guest, because you just said that you didn't know 2 years ago about the ultra-low emission zone coming in.
Yes.
I'm afraid it was actually announced as coming in by the previous Mayor of London in 2015. So we've actually now known for 4 years that the ultra-low emission zone was going to be coming in. I'm terribly sorry that 2 years ago you failed to notice that it had been announced, but it's been trailed through multiple consultations since 2016, which is 3 years ago, announced originally 2015, and it was very clear then that you would need to comply with it.
But it was brought forward, and that's where the issue.
My point.
That is the issue. It was brought forward.
You know, he claimed that 2 years ago he didn't know about it. It's not a new initiative.
Thank you.
The congestion charge wasn't, though, was it?
Yes, the congestion charge wasn't.
He said ULEZ. He said ULEZ.
Steve Wright would like to comment on...
Can I clarify
I'm not
ULEZ,
talking
please?
about the congestion charge.
Can I clarify ULEZ? Because I was amongst the people, as a TfL board member and as a trade representative, that sat down with the ULEZ team and worked out a realistic time frame for its introduction. The problem is the goalposts have moved, and people that have bought vehicles in good faith 2 years ago, prior to the last consultation, where it was changed, the dates and times, we sat down with the ULEZ team, meeting after meeting, and established the art of the possible, so that people wouldn't get it caught in the trap that there was there. Yes, ULEZ has been there, but we need the vehicles to be there. Yes. We need people to be able to sell on their vehicles when they finished in the ULEZ. And ASH is typical of many drivers that are self-employed, and self-employed worked. I did 500,000 miles as a self-employed driver, that are now trapped. And they're trapped because the ULEZ goalposts have moved. Yes. And we mustn't lose sight of that. Yes, it's been there for 4 years, but actually the rules have changed midway.
Yes.
That's what's happened.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Are you finished your questions, Caroline?
That's fine.
Okay, Flo.
One of the other things that we've seen, and I think a lot of Londoners will actually welcome it, is some of TfL's proposals in terms of entry requirements, and to make for your drivers, you know, some things that would help them in terms of their safety and the passengers' safeties. Do you think that some of the additional proposals will have an impact on your business model on the day-to-day? So English language test, additional licensing testing. Does anyone want to comment on that?
So I think you're exactly right. A lot of the proposals and regulation changes have at their beginning very noble and good intentions. Nobody can argue that having a safer private hire industry is a good thing. Nobody can argue that having cleaner air in London is a good thing. All of these are things that everybody around this table agree with 100%. Where it's fallen down from an industry perspective is that the consultation has been, in many cases, less than meaningful, and in many cases where the trade has come forward with proposals that are sensible and achieve the objectives that are set out, they've been ignored or railroaded, and the original proposals, as stated, were made into regulations. You mentioned the English language requirement. That in itself was something we proposed a very different approach 3-4 years ago. One that's been echoed by Mohammed Al-Haq in the recent government report, which was ignored and pushed forward in the current form. That's caused a lot of unnecessary difficulty within the industry. It's caused a lot of individual drivers to go through a level of stress that was really unnecessary. And had there been proper and meaningful consultation with the trade, and the view of the people who are actually out there having to deliver this service was taken into proper account, we can come up with better regulations in almost every occasion and still achieve the objectives set out, which is a safe a safe industry and one that contributes to a cleaner environment for us all who live and work in London.
Flo, can I just interrupt you, if you forgive me? There are rumours on the BBC that there's going to be an announcement shortly that the English language test is going to be taken forward to 2021. Well, I'm waiting for that to come out. It may well come out
and
coincidentally while we're sitting here.
And if
thank
that's
you for
the case,
describing the problems.
Exactly, and if that's the case, then one would assume that this is as a result of the task and finish report from Mohammed Al-Haq, and that was exactly the proposals that the industry was putting into Transport for London 3 or 4 years ago. So this whole scenario could have been avoided.
They're listening. Forgive me. Sorry, Flo.
And as Assembly members, we did also raise our concerns about that. So we definitely agree that all drivers should have an adequate standard of English, but we were concerned with the proposal that TfL put forward in its
the
original
level of
form.
qualification.
The other thing I wanted to add was around additional driver assessments and renewal of the licensing. So bus drivers have to take this on a regular basis. As your drivers are carrying passengers, would you not feel that this is an assessment that should be welcomed? What's your view on the additional assessments that's been proposed?
Again, it's very difficult to make any kind of argument, and I wouldn't seek to make any kind of argument that opposes measures to improve passenger safety. I think what's important is any regulation change needs to take into account the practicalities of actually delivering on that regulation change. And actually, does it achieve the objectives set out, or does it achieve far more than was originally intended, and does it cause damage to the industry and ultimately the people that the industry serve? And that seems to be the approach to a lot of the regulation change now, that it becomes something, hesitate to use it, but it's, in many cases a sledgehammer to crack a nut, in terms of, starting with an original objective and then occasionally looking back and saying, are we still just looking to achieve that objective, or have we crept into a whole range of other changes and regulations that potentially are unnecessary and just costly?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I share your concerns, but on the other hand, there are a number of changes, especially when you're driving in London. So one of the things which I hope that you are getting your drivers to look at is the Mayor's approach on Vision Zero in terms of deaths in London with people on the road. So some of these additional assessments by TfL is to help drivers in terms of getting up to speed with some of those additional changes. So, for example, if you felt that the additional testing may be onerous and costly, is there an additional assessment you as operators may want to put in place to make sure your drivers are up to speed with latest, requirements, disability training, awareness of vulnerable drivers, passengers?
You're exactly right, and if you talk to most operators, what they'll tell you is that they have extensive programs themselves already that would probably meet or exceed the requirements. So if I talk about my own company, we have extensive training. Each of our drivers goes through a minimum of 10 days training every year to cover exactly what you're talking about. All of our vehicles are equipped with full telematics, with drive cams, with speed limiters, with any number of safety enhancing features at great cost to us. And this is what we've decided to do from a commercial basis to differentiate what we do. And most operators are the same. Each operator has a different approach, but is achieving the same objectives. And this is exactly why, with meaningful engagement with the trade, I believe that TfL can achieve all the objectives that they would like to achieve without damaging the industry that they're seeking to regulate. Because most of us would meet or exceed those requirements anyway, and perhaps we're just doing it in a different way. So engagement is absolutely vital.
Thank you. Before I bring Sean in, he's going to ask in a minute. I saw you
Yes,
indicating...
I can't hear very well from this position of what Greg is saying, but I noticed that you said that maybe the date will change for the English test, and we as an organisation are very concerned about the number of drivers that may now that feel now that they are going to be on the benefits pile, because we get calls day in, day out. We have had since January 2017, but mostly middle-aged drivers who are concerned that they're going to lose their job because they can't pass the test because they're dyslexic. And to prove that they are dyslexic, they have to undergo an assessment which costs them £500. They don't have any evidence from school days, there's nothing provided in school to give them that evidence, and there was especially nothing, way back. They have all that, and even with the assessment, they can only get additional time. With additional time, if you find it difficult to write, you're going to find it difficult to write no matter how long you're given. And I think Florence there said something about, what about I couldn't hear you very well, sorry, about the health and safety issues. There's plenty of assistive technology out there that can help with reading, and, we do agree that there must be health and safety policies in place for these drivers to keep up to date. But to actually have to write a letter seems totally inappropriate, and we go along with Professor Admin Carr, I think his report, saying they need to be able to communicate, but the test at the moment doesn't seem fit for purpose for dyslexic drivers. Many dyslexics have chosen this pathway as a career, thinking they wouldn't have to do tests or they wouldn't have to write and do a jolly good job, but now faced with being on the benefits pile.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we've got TfL, as you know, coming in afterwards. We will specifically put that to them at that section. So thank you. Sean.
Very quick question. Maybe one of the trade bodies can answer. What is the accident rate? What is the rate of accidents amongst drivers in this industry in general? Is it very high? Is it low?
It's actually far less than the average driver, because they're professional drivers and they work day in and day out. Many of them do training. Many have been through the Energy Saving Trust course about how to take the foot off the accelerator and reduce the emissions and what have you. The industry's got a very good insurance record. Yes, of course, there are the big spectacular unfortunate accidents with 90-odd thousand private hire vehicles and taxis out there. There are going to be accidents, but generally, touch wood, the accident rate is not, the private motorist is far more likely to have an accident than a private hired professional driver. That's been the experience, and you get that information from the claims companies that charge the appropriate premium, even though they're on the road. And this is important. Somebody mentioned hours earlier. It's actually driving hours that's critical. And there's not many private hire drivers that do more than 25, 30 hours a week actually driving. A lot of it's rest periods in between jobs. So that's another factor why there aren't, proportionally to the hours that they work, there aren't that many accidents.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. You've been so good, thank you. I've got 10 more minutes that I've allowed us for the questioning. So, it's really important that your issues are aired here, because you are vital to the economy of London, your businesses, and you could affect jobs, as we've heard. So, anybody that hasn't spoken, that's got something completely different to say, I'll stop it at 10 minutes so that we keep within time. Robert.
I'd like to touch on a couple of questions that Florence and Sean mentioned earlier on the sort of impact that these new policies are having on my business specifically. I'm probably one of the smallest operators sitting around this table. I have 10 vehicles, and they're all hyper niche, original classic Mini Coopers. I've got 30 drivers in my team as well, so I'm a very small business, but the impact is going to be profound. The £24 a day charge will, of course, cost me £240 per day to get my vehicles out of the car park, because I'll be paying ULEZ and the congestion charge, because my vehicles don't have a host and health chance of meeting either criteria. So you're looking at £1,300 a week, £5,000 a month to run my business. And it's a very small niche business. So the reality is that this could put me out of business within 1 to 3 months if the state of play stays as it is. The particularly perplexing and frustrating situation that I have is that TfL have already exempt me from the Air Quality Act that limits private hire vehicles to 10 years old, which came into effect several years ago. So ULEZ, ultimately, its decision is to try and enforce cleaner, more efficient vehicles on the road, which is what the Air Quality Act did to limit them to 10 years. And TfL deemed my niche business already valuable enough to kind of warrant an exemption. But the criteria has changed ever so slightly, and now there's no exemptions being made. So the reality is we will probably go out of business within the next 3 months. when the implementation of this new legislation comes into effect.
Oh dear, Roderick.
I've listened and to some of your questions, and there's quite a few operators around the table, and I was an operator of a business that had 800 vehicles. If I wanted to get back into the industry, and I am trying to, I face a licensing fee of £500,000. But that's not where I am today. The feeding force that drives this private hire industry is the people. And those people, 70-odd thousand of them in London, are predominantly BAME people. They're people from underrepresented groups. They've taken their money and they've worked in this industry for quite some time. I heard the lady talk about the consultation process, and I'm aware of that, and quite a few of them were aware of that. And as we said, I'm not going to rehearse it, but the actual changing of the goalposts has happened. But what you've got to look at is these people. These people are predominantly at the bottom of the food chain that work for operators and for themselves. They have gone and bought their cars, and now they've got to bin those cars. Some of them have struggled and got joint names to get finance for their vehicles. Those vehicles are now going to go on the scrap heap, no matter whatever scrappage scheme you try to talk about or implement. They haven't been consulted. As far as I'm looking at what's going forward, there hasn't been a financial impact assessment, and there hasn't been a race equality impact assessment, because if they had done that, they would have seen the damage that they're doing to predominantly 85% of the private hire drivers in London. It's not just about us and our vehicles. It is about those people. Now, you've got 2 or 3 or maybe 4,000 women, mother returners to work, that work at times when their husbands come home inside those businesses. And when I say women, I say people that identify as women. They work in those businesses. What do they do? What do they do? There's a supply chain around this. And it's not just to sit here and to talk about just the ULEZ, the fees and whatever. Yes, the operators are impacted, operators going to the wall, because I would have to pay £500,000, end of story, and my business was predominantly moving 5,000 to 6,000 disabled people every day for 29 local councils. So it is a service which is a valuable service. I say to any of you, you go to London Bridge Station and the trains are cancelled, you'd head for a private hire vehicle. That is where you will go to. Nothing else. Buses don't run. Where there's problems in London, you want to get to the airport, the trains don't run, you head for a private hire vehicle. Those people that we are now treating at the bottom of the food chain, at the end of the day, implementing and adding costs to what they do. And I'll give you this. The last government administration, be it Lib Dem and Conservative, gave people £12,000 of free pay. In one fell swoop, this regulations that you're trying to bring has taken away their free pay. So when you look at these people and they blockade London, they don't want to lose money to blockade London. And I make reference to the Bangladeshi Association that blockaded London last week. They're doing it because their poverty is driving them into the ground. As far as I'm concerned, these people look at this industry and it's something that they believe they can do, and they don't need an A level or a Z level. And we have somebody that attended one of our gatherings, and the gentleman had been working for 35 years in private hire, and he was physically there crying because he felt threatened, because he knew that he could speak English and he could communicate like I am to you today. But for some reason, this test that you're talking about may be pushed back, will come into play. But I say this to you today. We're here in front of you and we're talking about this. But first and foremost, you look at those people that are affected by it. And it's the BAME population of London, and they are the driving force of this private hire industry.
Can I come in quickly, please?
Yes.
Just on that, thank you, Roderick. And again, I've met with some of those drivers, and like I said, as Assembly members, we have been putting some of these concerns directly to TfL. And to all of you as well, the nature of travelling in London is changing. Have you seen a demand for your services, or is there still a high demand? And are you still recruiting drivers, or has there been a decline in that? Because I look at my commuting patterns from 5 years ago to now, it's changed. And that will be the case for many Londoners. Would you say that there's still a high demand for your services?
So the majority of our work is actually carrying out non-emergency patient transfer services, which is actually growing year on year. So this is people that are too sick to use public transport, but don't need an ambulance, and that's where we come in as a business. And this has been, as I say, this has been growing year on year. So there is actually a growing demand for these services. So the other thing to consider in that instance is these price rises, these increases, are actually going direct to the NHS.
Did anybody else want to? I'll take Sue and then Abu and then Diana. Sue first.
Yeah, and my colleague here spoke about impact assessment. As far as we're aware, there was no impact assessment with regard to dyslexic drivers for the English test, and we'd like to be involved with TfL and going forward to make this happen, because we found it really difficult to communicate with TfL on this issue, whereas they have been really supportive with tube drivers and black cab drivers, giving them assessments and workshops to improve their skills. There has been nothing for this sector, and we feel there should be an impact assessment and that we should be involved there and giving advice. We found it really difficult. 56% of businesses surveyed by the government do not look at literacy skills, and we wonder why this has happened for this sector.
Thank you. Well, I'm hoping TfL are listening, and let's hope we get some answers. Abu.
Yes, thanks. I agree 100% with the gentleman what he said, that the impact it will have on the drivers. And my yearly cost for, as I mentioned, ullage and congestion charge will wipe out £6,000 from my income, and I will end up about £9,000 a year after my tax. Will anybody will be support their family with £8,000 or £9,000 a year? I reasonably doubt is no. And I would like to respond to Ms. Cooper's question.
Member Cooper.
Yes. So I was aware at the time of buying my car that there will be a ULEZ charge, but not starting from April 2019, but from 2020. And I was hoping that during those extra years, I would make sufficient cash to exchange or, say, part exchange my car. And unfortunately, at that time, there was no proposal for congestion charge imposing to the TfL drivers.
There was also no proposal at that time for scrappage, which was the other point that I didn't get on to make. Have you applied for scrappage, given that your vehicle is a Euro 5 and you do need to upgrade to a Euro 6?
I have actually not yet, but I don't think so. It will help me that much, because to buy a fully electric car, it's so expensive. Not only that, there is no infrastructure for charging, you see. It's not good enough to buy an electric car. If I cannot charge it, I'll not be able to use it, you see.
You haven't applied for it and you haven't looked into it. That's what you're saying. You haven't looked into the details of the scrappage.
Yes, if I even get this, if I even get the scrappage.
Scrappage available for private hire. There's no funding available.
Sorry, there's no funding available.
I don't believe there's any money set aside for private hire scrappage. There is for taxi.
For the black cabs.
But it's the point is the vehicle isn't that old anyway. He bought it in good faith on looking at it on a 4-year cycle.
I don't know how old it is. He only told us it was Euro 5. Right. Yes. He didn't say how old it actually was.
Can we establish if there's scrappage? There isn't. That's why.
We're not aware of any scrappage.
In the meantime, there's no scrappage.
There is no scrappage.
Right. Okay. Let's go to Diana.
I wanted to say.
Hold on.
If we can go to Diana, then we'll come to you, Roderick.
The question that started this was: is there any increased demand for our services? The demand for our services far exceeds the amount of drivers available. I don't think there's one operator in London who has enough drivers to cover. My core business is SEN transport. Every day we get more and more requests to transport children to school, more and more requests to transfer hospital patients, and we can't cover the work. The answer goes back from the council to social workers, to the parents. No resources. We cannot cope because more and more drivers are coming out of the trade for various reasons.
Okay, thank you. And the last very short point, and thank you all so much for keeping this concise.
I wanted to Assembly Member Eslom, I was going to respond, that this industry is a technology industry. Your mobile phone, you can book a car anywhere. It's a boon to London. We sit here and you can be picked up in 5-10 minutes outside this building. But what I will say to you is this: you mentioned scrappage. Scrappage is the private hire drivers that will be on the scrap heap if some of these regulations go through. And when I get asked what should they do, and I'm not going to rehearse all of it, and I'll just say it now, I say to them, 2020 is not just the day they bring this legislation in. 2020 is there is an election. And 71,000 of our members out there that drive these vehicles, they have a vote. Exercise your vote. And at the end of the day, you'll be able to do something about this.
This is relevant to our investigation. Okay.
Particularly.
Thank you. Anyway, I think thank you. The first little bit of this has just proved that 12 of you can keep within time, and I'm very grateful to you.
Ask a question?
Well, we're going on to the next section. So if
I just wanted to ask a question, because we do seem to be focusing as if all of the private hire vehicle operators are only operating within the central London congestion zone, or at the moment, because we're talking as if everyone is going to have both the congestion charge and the ULEZ applied to them. My understanding is that there has been a growth in the number of private hire vehicles on the road during 2018, and I'm wondering whether that has, and you're talking a lot about some very useful activities like taking people to hospitals and so on and so forth. Now, not all of those hospitals are contained within the central London congestion zone, so I'm wondering how much there has been an opportunity to expand what people are doing around the table without being subject to those extra charges in the outer London areas.
The thing is, it's not just that, it's pretty multifactional, this whole thing. If you can answer that very quickly, Steve.
The actual number that's in the last set of reports from TfL, it's dropped 10,000, and the type of driver that's working in central London is often doing 9-15 hours a week, but the core industry, the 24/7 industry that supports the whole of London, is getting caught by these regulations. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go on to the next section, which is what needs to change in the Mayor's approach to make things better for you. So how can the Mayor help minicab operators in London? If I start at you, Steve.
I'll just make one point about, having been through process, been working with Ken Livingstone, coming to Marsham Street before this was built, worked with John Biggs and various other people politically on things. One of the things that seems to happen is policy is given to us as a fait accompli. Any consultation that is done seems to pay lip service to what we actually set out of the needs of the industry. We are tick-boxed. We're given no notice. Bear in mind the industry and what it is, the timing of the congestion charge 3 days before Christmas, and that won't affect the court case. That's not enough for an industry to change its systems and actually get in place. It's the same with the ULEZ. You need a 4 or 5 year lead time. And I did take the manufacturers along to the TfL because vehicles and the electric, it takes time. The industry needs more notice to be able to adapt to change.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Greg?
So I think, to answer the question, what can be done to improve things, I think, to echo Steve's point, consultation. I think talking and listening to those who deliver the service, finding common ground. At the end of the day, we're a trade, we're regulated. We're not the tail trying to wag the dog. We understand that we have to be regulated, but we also are the ones who are on the ground, working with our drivers, delivering a service on a day-to-day basis. And I think if we focus on the prize, which is the objective of the regulation change, and allow everyone to have the input, and more importantly, listen and allow that input to shape the final regulation, we'll come up with regulations that are fit for purpose, that don't damage the trade, that deliver a better and safer service to Londoners. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all here to do. As commercial organisations, it can only be a good thing if we're viewed positively in every possible way, because more people are going to use our service. There's no mutual exclusivity here. We should have the same objectives.
Okay, Caroline, you wanted to ask?
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that both Roderick and Abu had raised about workers' rights. And the Assembly passed a motion 2 years ago saying that workers' rights should be built into licensing arrangements in future so that people got their sick pay and holiday pay, and the operators committed to those working conditions. What is the view of operators around the table on actually in the future building workers' rights into operating licences?
I sat next to Frank Field on a committee on workers' rights with Professor Mohammed Al-Haq about the difficulties, because in a self-employed, if you choose to be self-employed, and I did 500,000 miles in 15 years as a self-employed driver, which was my choice, without sick pay, without pension, without maternity, paternity, etc., etc. It was a choice that I'd made. The problem is that in the industry, as a self-employed person that chooses to come, do an hour here because it's convenient, may work for 7, 8, 9, 10 different companies. They make that choice to be self-employed. I made the choice to go to Sweden for 3 months during my employment. I wanted that flexibility, and many of the people that are actually in the industry want to work like that and are not seeking workers' rights.
Of course, there are some people who are privileged enough to be able to take that flexibility, but there are many drivers who I've spoken to who are working on the Uber platform who are not in that position and are working very long hours on very, very low pay.
Well,
so I think it's sort of it's making sure that these people who are delivering what is, you've made a very good case for the importance of this service, deliver it, particularly for, the minibuses taking children to school, SEN children to school, and patients to hospitals and things like that, in terms of the service it delivers for London and Londoners. But I think there are a lot of drivers who are working in conditions where they don't feel that they're benefiting from that choice to be self-employed.
I agree, but I'd make the point that they make the choice of where they work. If you actually look at our magazine, you'll see adverts for £1,000 employed positions within our industry. If you make the position to work for a company where you can come and go as you please, the downside to that is you may not earn as much money. But there are many, many positions. We did a show at a meeting with 250 people the other week on not an app-based company, but traditional private hire operators that have infrastructure. Every single one of them needed drivers, and every single one of them was prepared to guarantee a great deal of pay.
Okay, I've seen 3 people that want to come in on that. Can you keep it brief? Because the actual original question was, how can we get the Mayor to help with all the minicabs? So if you can answer Caroline's in order.
into the
Roderick,
operating
Greg
licence.
and Diana, if you can give brief answers, and if they're not the same, that would be great.
Yeah, basically, yeah. How you've come across when you mentioned Uber, not everybody is Uber. At the end of the day, the majority of private hire companies have standards. And I'd like to think that regardless if you're self-employed or employed, that you've got certain basic minimum standards. If you want to use, I wouldn't use Uber as an example, but what I would say to you, I wouldn't use it as an example, but what I would say to you is, as someone that had both, I made sure that they had certain privileges. And yes, legislation has caught up and we've got to do things differently, but that doesn't mean to say that you treat the drivers as second-class citizens.
Certainly. Right, Greg?
So partly to reiterate Steve's point, we employ 200 drivers, and they're all full employees of my company. I have a vacancy rate consistently of around 15 to 20% of empty vacancies, and the vast majority of people who come to my company inquiring about a position with us reject the offer when they find out that it's an employed position, and as such they have to work certain shifts and meet certain rules and meet the obligations of an employee, even though they're being offered all the benefits of pension, holiday pay, sick pay, and everything you'd expect as an employee. So I think that just reiterates the point that drivers want the choice, and the vast majority, and I think you can take Uber and put it to one side because it's a very different animal to the rest of the industry. The vast majority of drivers are doing the job that they do because they chose that method. There are employed and self-employed positions available, and they're equally available. There's no barrier to a driver who wants to work as an employee to stop them doing that.
Greg, can I just come back to you on the vacancy level?
Yeah.
How many of your drivers are Europeans? And are you going to be affected by any new immigration controls that come in post-Brexit?
We will be. I would say probably 25% of our drivers are East European, and potentially issues there. Although that percentage of East European versus other ethnicities has changed in the last 2 to 3 years.
But in what respect? Gone up or down?
Down.
It's gone down?
Yes.
Okay. And anybody else who employs people, how do you think that'll affect you?
I vouch for what Greg's saying. I agree with these comments the same entirely. So we have a mix of ethnicities. And recently I would agree with his comments about the percentages.
Right, can we go back to Caroline's question? Diana, you were going to answer that.
Again, I was going to, just going to
say something then as well.
Well,
I did, but I was
is basically you don't have to work for Uber. If those drivers are struggling and earning less money and working long hours, they don't have to stay there. That's the point of being self-employed. You can move. You can go to other companies.
You're saying that there are lots of jobs in other companies that are available at the moment.
That's the whole point. We are all short of drivers. We turn work down all the time. Every single operator that I know of has a shortage of staff.
Thank you. And Robert, you were going to answer.
I was
Andrew's
actually going to answer Assembly Member Hall's direct question, which is what can the Mayor do directly in order to help our industry? And that is accept the fact that the private hire industry bridges the gap between the failings of public transport and provides an absolutely core, necessary mode of transport for millions of disabled, elderly and inactive people, and exempt private hire vehicles from the ULEZ and the congestion charge. It's a very, very small minority of cars that are private hire vehicles that are on the road already. He can still have his vision of a cleaner, safer, less congested city by exempting and still just exempt private hire vehicles. If you did that, everybody is still employed, everybody's business survives, everybody can still thrive, and his vision is still met. I don't understand why that is not happening.
Do you think the Mayor should have powers to cap the number of private hire vehicles he can have in London, Robert?
It's a dangerous game, isn't it, when you start having that level of control. I do think that the industry will become naturally competitively regulated. It's already so competitive that it naturally weeds out competition. So there is a market saturation point, which we're already kind of approaching.
But you may be aware that there's a current trial in New York in terms of where the Transport Authority there have
I'm aware.
a cap. So I think it's a case of, in looking at the fact that London is congested, continues to get congested, population is going up, the space on our roads are not increasing. So how do we balance all those different competing demands on the roads and making sure that London continues to move and thrive, like you're saying?
Absolutely, but these rules are already affecting the majority of Londoners, so they've already disincentivised any form of car movement. It's excruciatingly expensive to drive your car into central London already.
I declare an interest. I'm a driver in London. So.
I drive, I cycle, I commute, I get the train.
Yeah.
I use all forms of modes of transport myself as well personally. It's already disincentivised. The go-to punishing of the car when there is an absolute important economic necessity for that vehicle, it cannot be ignored.
Okay, Steve wanted to come in on
I
that.
can answer that question because I took the trouble to feed back how it could be achieved, how congestion could be removed, and so did our members. It's very simple. Private hire vehicles are not allowed to go into central London without a job. The big app-only companies' drivers go in. At the moment, TfL penalise 3% of the drivers that are going in. You can stop people coming into central London with the mechanism of the congestion charge legislation and the exemption that Ken Livingstone actually gave us at the time. There's a mechanism to do that. That was fed forward to the Transport Committee here, to the consultation. It's been ignored. The wrong way of stopping the congestion, I accept that app-only companies have caused congestion because they've been allowed to come into central London without a job. There's regulation in place to prevent that. You just have to use the existing powers that you have and you'll have less congestion from private. These guys are just doing the same work they've always done. You're not sending cars into central London. We called it honeypotting and clustering. And I gave the same evidence to Professor Mohammed Al-Haq, and that's why the crude mechanism of a cap doesn't work, because everybody in this room is short of drivers.
I saw you indicate first. Did you want to come back on that?
Just in terms of capping, you mentioned New York. My company actually operates in New York, and the unintended consequence of that is a number of taxis and the equivalent of private hire vehicles in New York increased by 25% in the run-up to the cap being introduced, because companies were just registering thousands of cars. So, anything you do to artificially manipulate the marketplace is going to have unintended consequences, and that's seen time and time again.
Okay, thank you. Roderick.
I say to your idea about the cap, no. And I'd use TfL's own London Dial-A-Ride as an example. You have 600 and 700,000 unmet need jobs per year, at least. And at the end of the day, it's because we haven't got enough members. We ain't got enough drivers. We ain't got enough vehicles. So we can't meet your needs. So to cap it and make it a damn sight worse.
Okay, going back to my original question, if anybody hasn't said anything, how can the Mayor help minicab operators in London? Is there anything that you think that you could say to do with that, Abu?
Yes, I think that this ullage and congestion charge scheme should be put on hold unless or at a time when it's affordable to get an electric car and there are enough infrastructure available for recharging the car. Then it will greatly help us.
Yes, I must say the recharging situation is ludicrous at the moment. To insist you have electric vehicles and then not allow
And just to set the example, we run over 200 vehicles, all under 2 years old, with some of the latest technology, like Greg alluded to, stop-start technology. But to look at the infrastructure of charging those vehicles at Heathrow Airport, through the number of terminals there's 16 charging points. And you think about the number of cars and movements that go through that location every single day. There just isn't the infrastructure to support it. But a lot of our business, we want to change, we want to support the change and run the cleanest vehicles that manufacturers have to offer, but the pure availability of them is just non-existent at this moment in time.
Okay, Zoe.
I'd just like to echo that point, really. We invested in a fully electric car fleet just over a year ago in the hope that we could drive that forward. But it's near on impossible to make a profit from these vehicles because they spend so much time off the road trying to find a charging point, which are broken or out of order. And then, you're then subsidising the driver, having to pay him when he's not actually working because it's not his fault. So the model just didn't work.
Right, Roderick?
Yeah, we're in the London Borough of Southwark, one of the biggest social housing landlords in Europe. Quite a few people live in tower blocks. The infrastructure's not there. How would they plug in their car? Or if they could find one, if they could afford one, the infrastructure is clearly not there. And I use this borough, London Borough of Southwark, as an example.
I'd like to give an example that Southwark is one of the best boroughs in terms of charging points. We have that data, and I'm not just saying that as the Assembly Member for Lambeth and Southwark, but Southwark are leading the way in terms of charging points. But totally agree with you that,
exactly.
And this is something we have.
I raised it with Peter John, who's now the chair of London Councils. I said it's a disgrace.
No,
but they don't allow it.
We have been raising on Transport Committee in terms of there needs to be a lot more working with the boroughs in terms of providing rapid electric charging points.
Well, I'm hoping that TfL are listening to this and can give us a solution, because you cannot insist that you go electric and then not supply the infrastructure there. We've done extremely well. Anybody else, anything different that the Mayor can do to assist? If not, I'm going to ask Steve Wright and Steve Hall to conclude this particular section. No, nothing else.
Sorry, Chair, I just wanted to ask if you'd seen, because obviously we are looking at the economic impact. Since we've had the night tube launch, do you feel that that's affected your industry in any way? Has it helped? Have you seen a decline for those of you who probably transport people at night? No, I don't think so.
I think just in terms of the night tube, clearly that last half mile home from the night tube,
London boroughs.
And even within London, we have competitors in black taxis who 11, 12 o'clock at night, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, they're not there. It's private hire vehicles that are available. When you need a car at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's a private hire vehicle that you're going to call. And it's our drivers who are out at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning providing that service.
Okay. Just to come in on that point, because as a board member, we helped to push that through, and it's a very positive step. I declare an interest. I started as a London Underground apprentice, so I'm a very big fan of getting people home. What it's done is disseminated clustering traffic from central London out to the regions. These people sitting around here the last mile home for those people, and they're an integrated part of the transport network. So it's a very positive step, the last mile home, and I'd like to see all the tube 24/7 personally, but it's got maintenance challenges, of course.
I just say yes, it's been brilliant. We've all got extra work because it's us who take the train drivers to and from to pick up the trains and take them home afterwards.
This is my question, the one about the extra work that's changed into the outer London boroughs as opposed to always working in the inner London boroughs. And I think you know, the scene is changing, isn't it?
Peter, got something different to add?
I think you should take into consideration that we're not all minicabs. The two of us here, we provide guided tours. And I think TfL ought to acknowledge the difference between a minicab company and people who offer a tourist guide service, as we do. For instance, you're talking about people operating outside the congestion zone. We drive into the congestion zone because we have no choice. This is where we work. We show people London. And even if we're not doing a tour inside the congestion zone, we may take people to the Cotswolds or Stratford. We often pick up within the congestion zone. And there are times when we go only just inside the congestion zone. If I'm picking up at the Marriott Park Lane, the hotel entrance is about 20 yards inside the congestion zone. And I for 20 yards, for a few minutes to pick up my clients, take them off to Stonehenge, will cost me £24. So I think there should be an overview of the sort of work that we do and the impact on the congestion charge and the ULEZ charge, and also understand there are different people doing different trades who have to be licensed under private hire regulations.
And thank you for bringing that, because I'm hearing things from my left. The reason you have been included is because we do depend on our tourism trade. You are under very much the same rules as the other ladies and gentlemen. And it's absolutely right and proper that you are included in the conversation, and I thank you for being here. Right, Steve, would you like to? Would you like to sum up?
Well, first of all, Chair, thank you and Assembly members for hosting us. I think there was some trepidation as to whether the minicab industry, as it's rather stereotyped, could actually come to and articulate its point of view succinctly, but I think my colleagues here today have proven that this whole exercise has been worthwhile, and we're very grateful to Assembly members for giving us the time. It's jaw, not war, war. There are solutions we need to be engaged with, and we can only give back in return. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing in addition, Chair.
Okay, so I do most sincerely thank you all for coming and for keeping points succinct. As I said earlier, it does prove that we can have lots of guests and get through things. We've got TfL coming next, and a couple of the points that I've picked up, so I'll just clarify in case any of you can think of anything else. Not enough PowerPoints, loud and clear, I'm listening to that, and I'm hoping they will listen. You can't buy the vehicles that you've got to in order to come into London, because they don't make them. There's a limited number of electric cars also. I suspect you're also stuck with the same situation, that if it's dual electric and engine, very often you're going straight back onto engine, as I know the black cabs are having to do, because they can't get charging points either. So you'll end up with electric and motorised vehicles all using their motorised bits anyway, which defeats the object. There's lots of businesses unfortunately going down, for which we're sad. The dyslexia issue has got to be picked up on the English speaking test. There's an awful lot of work done, and thank you for the non-emergency transfer services. So you do an incredible amount of work there, and of course all that extra cost to you will be actually cost to everybody sitting around this table, because it's taxpayers going to be paying for the NHS. The services you provide for the disabled are just so vital, so we must be mindful of that situation. Stopping people coming in without a job is something I think really needs to be looked at, because it tends to get all of you a bad name and will cause more and more congestion in London. And of course the situation that it hits our tourism businesses is a real problem for the economy. And after all, this is the Economies Committee. We are concerned about the economy and jobs. And I think you've all proved that with all the things that are going wrong, the Mayor has got to address this. So I say thank you very much on behalf of all of us for coming. We're very grateful for your input.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I do this now? Yeah. So we're going to adjourn for 5 minutes while TfL come down. So the second part, we've got two guests. Thank you very much from TfL. Graham Robinson, General Manager, Taxi and Private Hire, and Christina Calderato, Head of Planning, Delivery, Transport for London. Thank you both. And I believe you were in the audience, so you heard the various comments. Well, before I actually go to the questions, you heard me sum up at the end of it. Can I just ask both of you to comment on not enough PowerPoints, can't buy the vehicles that they need, limited electric cars on the market, lots of businesses are going down.
The evidence wasn't that, Chair. The evidence was not that lots of businesses are going down
Comments
at all.
were made. Well, then
Yes.
they
Well,
they can argue with that. So, whichever one of you would like to start, can you just tell us briefly what you're going to do about those things? Because we've got the ladies and gentlemen in the audience. It'd be so nice for them to hear from TfL what they're going to do to address the issues that I did repeat.
I'll start and pick up on the rapid charge point issue. So TfL have installed already over 170 rapid charge points on the TLRN, the road network that TfL controls, and we have a target that we will install 300 by the end of 2020. We know that we need to have more, but what we need to do is work with the boroughs to get them in on borough roads. TfL are doing absolutely all we can to get as many rapids in as possible, and as I say, there's already over 170 available. The Mayor convened an EV infrastructure task force last May, and that's been working with charge point operators, with the private and public sectors, with boroughs, to identify what level of infrastructure we need to 2025 and identify a delivery plan for getting there. So that work has been ongoing, and there will be a delivery plan published as a result of that that will set out what we need to do over the next 5 years to really accelerate the uptake of EVs.
Could you say
can
when?
I just, excuse me.
Sorry.
Can I just point out that this should have been done before these other things were imposed, telling them they've got to get electric cabs, etc. We should have had the infrastructure properly in first, should we not?
Well, in terms of the vehicle requirement, so there's no requirement for electric vehicles for either the congestion charge or the ultra-low emission zone. So the vehicle standards for the ULEZ are a Euro 6 vehicle for diesel and a Euro 4 for petrol. And very broadly speaking, that equates to a 6-year-old diesel vehicle now or a 14-year-old petrol vehicle now. And for the congestion charge, there's no requirement to change your vehicle.
Sorry, Caroline, did you want to?
I just wanted to find out when the EV task force will publish, because we were told it was coming at the beginning of this year, and we're now into March, and we still haven't had a report from the EV task force. So do you know when that's due?
It will be coming soon. It will be out before the summer. It's
before the summer. So does that mean before May?
I think basically within the year of the task force having been convened, we'll be able to come back out with the plan, but we don't have a firm date on that yet, but it is forthcoming.
Okay, so it's been delayed from the early this year, which is when they convened. They said they were going to be publishing early this year.
I don't know the specifics of what was said at the time. I know that the work has been ongoing. There's been a series of workshops. They've been extremely well attended. The PHV industry have been involved as well. And that's come together into a delivery plan which will be published shortly. I don't have a precise date, I'm afraid.
So I just want to talk about this EV infrastructure. You say there's no requirement for EV vehicles for the ULEZ, which is correct. But if you're a taxi cab driver, there is a requirement for a hybrid vehicle which would need charging. How many taxi cabs do we have on the road that are currently switching to this new cab?
There are more than 1,100 zero-emission capable taxis on the road at the moment.
And when do we expect a significant bump in those 1,100?
Well, it's a requirement now since last year that all new to licensing vehicles have to be zero-emission capable. We have recently changed the delicensing scheme, which may accelerate the number of vehicles that are currently non-ZEC so that they transfer across to the ZEC vehicles. So we do expect the numbers to increase.
I think I'm trying to ask you about the rate. Do you have any idea of the rate of increase? Wild guess. Just.
Well, we're still looking to have 9,000 vehicles by the end of next year.
This leads me to my point. You talk about 300 charging points for 9,000 vehicles.
So I think that's what the task force is there to deliver. So that we recognise that as the vehicles accelerate, we're going to need to accelerate infrastructure. TfL cannot do that by itself. So we're doing all that we can, and now we're calling on boroughs and the private sector to work with us and make sure that we get that infrastructure in place. As it stands, the utilisation rate of rapids is such that they are not fully utilised. So there is still capacity in the rapid charging infrastructure that we have now.
Yeah, but that might be because there isn't enough of them, so people don't bother with them, if you see what I'm saying. If you talk to cab drivers, they say there's not enough of them, so we just tootle around on the engine because we can't find them at convenient points. If you do find one, you have to queue up. I think the point I make, we all know that's a fact, what I'm saying. The point I'm trying to make is the scale of ambition, the scale of ambition versus your delivery on cabs, they are unaligned spectacularly. We have 300 versus your 9,000.
There are 300 TfL points. There are more than that in total. I'm just telling you what TfL have put in as their part of this. There are more than that in total.
Can a cab driver use those other points?
Yes.
At the
There are
same
publicly
cost?
accessible points. There are TfL points. Some of the TfL points are solely dedicated to taxi use. And then there are others who are in car parks, which are also available to taxis.
So there's less than 300 and solely for cab use?
There are less than 300 solely for cab use. And there are more than 300 publicly accessible rapid charging points.
Okay, how many?
Sorry, I'm using the wrong number, more than 300. I don't have the precise number. So TfL have put in more than 170. It's 300 by the end of 2020. Sorry, to be clear.
Oh, so we only have 170 currently?
We have 170 TfL installed rapid charge points now, more than 170.
Okay. I think I'm labouring the point, but the point I'm trying to make is you've accelerated one part of your delivery to get you 9,000 early, but you haven't accelerated the important part, the infrastructure that makes that 9,000 possible. Remember, a £65,000 cab that I then can't use because I can't charge it up. You can see the problem there.
I think we can recognise the point you're making, and it is an area where we recognise there needs to be a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's an ongoing piece of work that we have to do. We can take away your point, and if there's more we can provide about what work we are going to do, but we do emphasise the point that this is something that we need the boroughs to work with us on, because we can only do so much on the road network that we control. So it does need more, and we're hoping that the industry as well and the wider market will recognise that going to electric vehicles is something that probably the nation is moving to. So we're hoping that they will help us as well and accelerate those numbers as we need to. But completely take your point, and we will take that away and make it clear. And if there is anything that we can explain about the acceleration ambitions we have, we can come back to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
So is it you I write to? Because I've been trying to get a response from TfL about various things and don't get a response. I hear all the time from both black cab drivers and minicab drivers that they can't get responses from TfL. So on this particular point, I can write to you about it, can I?
On that point, you can write to me, but I will pass it to my partners that are leading on the road rapid charge network being introduced. But I'm happy to take it and pass it on to
I don't mind
the
being
right
passed
partners.
on as long as then I get a response, because this is a real issue for minicabs and black cabs. They just have nowhere to recharge, and the number of times that I'm told that various charging points aren't working. Well, clearly this is totally unacceptable for our cab trades. I'll go on to the proper questions now, and then perhaps some of the other issues will emerge. The minicab industry says that your changes are driving operators out of business. Do you think they're exaggerating?
Well, it might be worth, I think it's very good to hear from the industry to say that they actually have a lot of work there and they just can't get hold of the drivers. I think that helps to explain that we still see it as a thriving industry. Looking at the numbers that we have, although we did have a peak of private hire drivers licensed a couple of years ago, there's still 106,000 drivers that are currently licensed. We have 87,000 private hire vehicles that are currently licensed, with to date, it's 2,221 operators that are licensed. That is a number that's reduced. However, it's been reducing over a number of years. We still feel that there is a thriving industry there. There's still a lot of interest on operators wanting to get licensed. So we don't have, I can't point to any statistics that talks about the actual amount of work that there is there, but I think our colleagues who know more are pointing that it is a thriving industry. So looking at the things that we're doing, we are always pointing towards safety, and that's always our primary concern. So any changes that are introduced will always be to ensure the safety of the travelling public and the drivers themselves. But we recognise that they do have an impact, and we try to ensure that we have understood that when those decisions are made.
Okay, so when you've looked at the industry, within a short period of time, these companies will have to deal with the ULEZ, with the new licensing rules, with congestion charge. So in your working out of the industry itself, how many companies do you assume will go out of business with that all hitting them at the same time?
That's something I wouldn't be able to give a number to. What I would be able to say is that when we're looking at the consultations that are carried out, we do carry out a full impact assessment. We do talk to our colleagues in the trade and ask for their opinions, and that is fully assessed when those decisions are made.
But you've done no actual profiling on what you think will happen?
It's not something that I could point to right now, but all the work that is done is available in our impact assessments.
Do you not think that that might have been sensible, given that they do so much work for disabled, disadvantaged people? We heard this morning taking people to and from hospital.
So I can pick up on that. So as part of the integrated impact assessment for congestion charging changes, we've looked at the economic and those kind of equality impacts. What I can say is there are other discounts and exemptions for the congestion charge which may apply to some of those trips. So there's an NHS reimbursement scheme which will apply to some of those patients who need to travel by vehicle. They will have are able to get their congestion charge reimbursed. PHVs carrying blue badge holders, the blue badge exemption will apply to the vehicle that carries them. There are some people who will be eligible for taxi cards. So we have looked at the impact on people on accessibility and the role of PHVs in doing that. And there are other discounts and exemptions which will apply to some of those trips. If I could just finish as well by saying that some of the school trips, there are already I think it's the 8 local authorities which are impacted by the charge. If any of them have PHV contracts for their school travel, they are also exempt.
Okay, have you stopped to consider how this will affect the tourism industry?
In terms of the congestion charge?
In terms of that, and also don't forget they have to be licensed as well.
So I think I'm also, I don't want to go further than I should in terms of talking about something where there might be legal action.
No, don't do that. I mean,
but I think specifically with regard to the ultra low emission zone, this is something we all have to play our part. London's toxic air is a public health crisis, and we can't stand by and do nothing. We all have to play our part, which is why the ultra low emission zone applies to businesses large and small, and in the tourism industry and others more widely, because this we can't stand idly by as Londoners' health and the health of children, particularly like in terms of development of their lungs, is impacted.
Yes, and you heard every single one of those guests this morning saying they totally understood that, but there's other aspects to all of this. Yeah. I'm going to stop because my colleague wants to...
I just want to ask about your impacts study and the increase in licensing fees. So many of the companies sat here this morning talked about what sound like huge rises in their license fees. What studies have you had to look at the cost, the impact, for their businesses, their survival of the business and employment?
This is
Sean,
actually coming
up in the next
question.
I'm sorry. Excuse me.
We've got a whole section on
Excuse
that.
me for being excited about what's going on this morning.
We're all anxious to get our questions because we're so miffed on behalf of minicab drivers, etc. So if I can just go on, where do you see your minicab's contribution to London?
I think it's worth just taking a step back and just say we fully recognise the services, the diverse services that are offered by the private hire industry, from chauffeur services to the work that was talked about, helping people get to and from hospitals, helping them with the nighttime economy, getting to and from work. And that's recognised that is an essential part of what we do. And we still see them as an integral part of the transport network across London.
Okay, and where do they fit into the Mayor's transport strategy?
Within that, as I say, they are recognised as an essential part of the transport network. That can be seen from the fact that it has their own specific taxi and private hire action plan. In that, I believe that he does state and sees that he wants to ensure that there is a fair and vibrant industry for both taxi and private hire. There's a number of things that we've been tasked to introduce to ensure that that happens, and we've been working on that for the last couple of years since it was introduced. We can see that we have had a private hire safety consultation last year that went through a number of things that we want to do. And again, primarily because we're the regulator, we always have to look at the fact that we're introducing things for the safety of the travelling public and for the drivers as well. We have had that safety consultation. We're considering where we want to go with that, whether the proposals are going to be implemented, and we are looking to see if there's another consultation this year. Again, that's looking at safety, but also looking at what's the responsibility of the operator.
Can I say something just on to add to that on the Mayor's transport strategy? That at the heart of the strategy is a commitment to an 80% sustainable travel, which is by walking, cycling, and by public transport. And it's really important that in central London, we absolutely maximise that high walking, cycling and public transport mode share. So ensuring that those who want to use active modes, it's most attractive and safe for them, as well as making sure that we make the best use of that scarce road space. In terms of congestion, London streets are the most congested, amongst the worst congested in the world, with worsening air quality, delaying bus services and freight trips, and too many streets becoming unpleasant for walking and cycling. Average speeds are forecast to fall across London, with central London particularly badly hit. If we don't take any further action, by 2041 it will take more than an hour to travel 10 kilometres in central London, which is 15 minutes longer than today. So the congestion charge has a really important part to play in managing that congestion in that area, and the discounts and exemptions have a direct impact on how effective that can be. So looking at that particular zone during charging hours, we have seen from the introduction of the charge in 2003, when there were an expected 4,000 minicabs in the zone a day, that we have gone up to now more than 18,000 private hire vehicles in the zone a day, which does have a significant impact on congestion.
Okay, so then I could respectfully suggest then that we double check that people coming into the exemption zones do actually have fares, because that's what I hear loud and clear.
So I'm happy to just respond on that. So for a number of years, we've had a monitoring activity every week where we do take a percentage of the vehicles that have come into the zone using our camera network, and if we recognise that they're private hire vehicles, we do contact them for them to prove that they have a fare. That's been ongoing for years, and whenever we find that they don't have a fare, we take action and remove the exemption from them so that they have to continue to pay the charge, and in some cases we will have taken the licence away from them. So that's something that we've been doing probably since the start of congestion charge, but certainly since my time working in taxi and private hire.
Well, perhaps we should look at upping those numbers that you're looking into. Christina, you said walking, cycling and public transport. That's great if you're perfectly able to do that. There are very many disabled people out there who need actually a way of getting around, and they can't walk, cycle, and many of the stations don't have lifts or anything else, so they can't use public transport either. So these operators provide an incredibly useful, needy service. And Graham, you said that the Mayor's wants to put in a fair and vibrant industry. Well, he's got a very funny way of showing that, given the information that we were told earlier.
Christina wanted to answer that point, so I think you should let her answer it.
So I think the 80% mode share is a London-wide figure, and I think we recognise that in central London, which is extremely accessible in terms of public transport, but also that we have a fully accessible a taxi service which has a wide range of accessibility features, and the congestion charge change and the ULEZ change in 2019 apply very specifically to that small central London area. The congestion charge applies Monday to Friday during charging hours. So this is looking very much at that scarce road space during that kind of most important part of the day, if you like. And as part of the impact assessment, as I say, we've looked at the impact on accessibility for people who require accessible modes, and have considered the role of the blue badge exemption, the role of taxi card, wheelchair accessible PHVs will retain their exemption as well, in recognition that we don't want to do anything that impacts accessibility. So I think when we're talking about that mode share, it's important to recognise that what's required in central London is very different to how it will be in inner and outer London.
We must remember that all disabled people aren't in wheelchairs by a very, very long margin. I think we'll go on to Carol.
Follow up on that. They've had this issue of additional costs raised, and that came up in the earlier session. And you talked about the impact assessment. Presumably additional costs are likely to be passed on in whole or in part to the end user, i.e. the passenger, in terms of additional costs. Have you done any work in part of the impact assessment, looking at what the impact would be should those charges be passed on to the customer in terms of the prices the customers are paying?
So in the consultation materials, which are all publicly available, we have looked at how operators may choose to manage that additional business cost. And it may be, essentially there are choices about whether it's paid for by the operator, the driver, or the registered keeper, or the end user. And I think in most cases we think it will probably be spread across all three. Our assessment was that it was likely that fares would rise between £1 and £2 for journeys within the zone.
Okay, Caroline, you set of questions.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the licence fees. First of all, could you just say what was the outcome that you were hoping for by increasing the licence fees, and have you had the outcome that you were seeking?
So it might be worth just taking a step back on the licence fees. So prior to 2017, we had a two-tier system, which meant that there were two types of operator licence, which was a small and standard licence. Mm-hmm. A small licence allowed an operator to have up to 2 vehicles with a charge of £1,488. If an operator had any more vehicles than that, they could buy a standard licence, which was £2,826. With the diversity of the market that we talked about, the services offered, we recognise that there are chauffeur services where it's a one-man operator, but there are operators that have tens of thousands of vehicles, and that two-tier system just didn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. So we undertook a consultation to look at how we could alter this to make it fairer and to spread our costs across the industry in a much more fairer way, and that's where we came with an 8-tier solution. Just recognising the fact that the need for this is to recover TfL's costs. There's no profit making in this. Anything that we need to come back has to go. So if there's any fees related to the operator, that is how we calculate the fee, which could come from on-street enforcement, compliance inspections, and the licensing administration that we carry out. As I say, it's not profit making in that regard. So we carried out a consultation. We considered the considerations of the points made by the trade. It was fully impact assessed. The 8-tier solution does have a broad range. We go from the fact that you may have somebody now that's paying 1,600, which is more than they were previously paying for 0 to 10 vehicles. But if you're in the largest bracket, you're almost paying £3 million. So it's a much fairer structure than that was there previously. However, we know that the trade have talked to us. They still don't think that it goes far enough. And it's something that we are looking into, whether there is more things that we can do. And I'll just say that in the time that it's been introduced, we have a lot more information available to us. Private hire operators now have to give us a weekly report of the number of drivers and vehicles that are available to them. This is invaluable to us to understand how the trade works. We now understand the number of drivers they have on a weekly basis, the number of active drivers working for them, and more importantly, what we didn't really understand before is the number of vehicles and drivers that work for multiple operators and the impact that would have on a different structure. So we are considering what options there are. I know the trade have talked to us about a particular option about having a per vehicle charge. That's something that we are looking to see if that's something that we could make work, and it would be a fairer solution. But it is complex. It's legally complex. It still has to be something we would introduce using the existing legislation that we have, which has its difficulties. And we will be looking at it throughout this year, and if we can make a proposal that will work, we will look to propose that with a full consultation and with the engagement of the trade.
It's certainly, I think, important that TfL is protecting the public interest by making sure that the larger operators are paying a fair share to cover the costs of regulation and keeping Londoners safe. So the point you make about the per driver charge, would those weekly reports that you say you're getting, is that how you might be able to implement something like that, so that it could, I mean, could you imagine a situation where it fluctuates, if operators have a fluctuating number of drivers, which is something we heard about earlier today, could those weekly reports provide a basis for...
So the weekly reports demonstrate that there is an element of seasonality, and we certainly understand that there are services that people offer where they may not offer any service for a period of the year, but then maybe only at Christmas or at certain times. So we recognise the seasonality within the trade, and we can see that in the statistics. What we have to recognise is there are certain limitations. We can only apply a charge at the point of licensing, and whereas there might be times when there is more vehicles on the road, that's very difficult for us to flex our compliance team up and down, so we can't suddenly not employ a certain number that we need for the peak periods and when we don't quite need them. So we do want to see what we can do with seasonality and flexibility, but it's not something we could suddenly charge for the number of vehicles that come in on a weekly basis, monthly basis, but we recognise that we need to see if there's something that we can do that's a bit more fair on that regard.
Okay. In terms of the smaller operators, what do you know of the impacts on the ones who are, I suppose it's the smaller operators who just get into another tier? Are they have they been giving you feedback?
Well, certainly we've talked to our colleagues in the trade, some of them that spoke earlier. They have highlighted that there's a number of difficulties with the current structure, in particular the fact that it can limit you if you need to change tier, move up or move down, in that you need to apply again. And that's something that will go into our thinking about how we could change the structure to see if we could address that. All of the points that the trade have made to us, we are considering, and there has been that dialogue. And that is why we will see if there is a fairer solution that we can find. But we have to recognise what we have now, compared to a two-tier system, it is a far fairer solution.
Indeed. And what about, has there been any impact on the drivers of this change in the way that the operators are licensed?
I wouldn't be able to point to any impact on the drivers. That's probably a question that you could put to the trade and see if there's anything specifically they could tell and we could look into it. I would just point back to the fact that we are still receiving over 1,000 applications a week from drivers wanting to be private hire drivers. So there is still clearly an interest in becoming a private hire driver.
Okay, thank you. And the fees have had a year to bed in. Have you have you actually, I mean, beyond what you've already said, is there any work that you've done or that you're planning to look at the impact on the smaller operators?
I think that would come into when we're looking at, when we have a proposal of the consultation and the impact assessment we would want to do then, that would look into those aspects.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of outer London, have you looked at the difference between the operators operating in outer London and inner London?
In terms of cost?
Yes, and in terms of the impact of the changes to the license arrangements, is there a difference in terms of the experience of an operator who's operating, I don't know, in Bexley or compared to an operator who's working in Southwark?
I think that's something that we'll probably have to take away. I do know that licensing authorities have similar cost structures that we have, and that's something that we have investigated as part of understanding other solutions that you can have for the pricing structure. But in terms of impact, there's not something I could point at now.
Okay, thank you. It would be interesting to hear if you do get any get any feedback on that. And then finally on this, the Assembly a couple of years ago passed a motion asking the Mayor to make workers' rights a condition of licensing, and I just wonder if you have any observations on that, because it's not in the current but you know, the rights to fair pay, holiday pay, sickness pay, and you know, if what makes a fit and proper operator is adhering to the law in terms of workers' rights. And I just wonder if you've got any observations on that.
What I can say is we are the regulator, which means that there are certain limitations of what we can do. The work that we do always has to be linked to safety and the safety of the travelling public. And however, having said that, I'm sure you've seen the policy statement that was issued last year and the expectations that the Mayor has with regards to the private hire industry, and that does reference the fact that they feel that it should be a fairer service for drivers, recognising working hours and recognising fair pay. It's not something that we can mandate with the powers that we have, but there's certainly something that we could do with regards to guidance and working with the operators themselves to recognise those sorts of areas and what they could do to help their drivers. We do recognise the court cases that there are, and that's something that we will watch. And once it's been completed, we will look to see if that means that there should be some changes when we are looking at operators and whether they are fit and proper.
So, because the latest judgments, the two latest judgments have said, in terms of Uber, have said that workers' rights, that the drivers for Uber are workers.
So that's been challenged again, hasn't it?
Okay. So you're saying you're waiting for that next
challenge? We will follow that through, and if once we have the judgment, if we feel that there's something that would impact the fit and proper nature of an operator, if they weren't complying with the legislation, that is something that we would look at.
Okay, thank you.
I'm mindful of time, but I've had three members indicate. Sean?
To go back to, I welcome your comments about you're looking at the licence and stuff, because I asked initially, did you do any impact study on what this would mean for operators having to pay this new licence structure? Correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you haven't, but you didn't, but you're making an adjustment now.
It's talking about there was a consultation carried out when we introduced the current 8-tier structure. I would have to go back and look into what was in that. I wasn't part of that, but I'm happy to look into and highlight what was considered in that.
Because this morning we had a range of operators there, and we heard of what were really quite steep increases. I'm shocked that nobody understood that would have a real effect on people's business. And why didn't this information come out of the consultation? Why didn't it come out of the impact study?
No, I think that what I'm saying is I can't point to directly what was in that impact assessment, but that impact assessment we did recognise that these are big changes in the money that we're talking about, but it is about recouping the money that is spent on the licensing service, on the enforcement that happens, recognising that we did make changes, we did significantly increase the number of compliance officers that are on the street, and that does have a cost to it, and that does mean that the licence fee will have to increase. So there is a recognition that will mean that licence fees had to go up, and it was, but we're talking about the structure here. When we actually calculate what the licence fee is, that is separate.
Yeah, but you according to the businesses we spoke to this morning, some of them were going to have a rise in their licence fee above their profit, effectively wiping them out. Why didn't that come out of the consultation? Why wasn't it in the impact study? Why weren't these very big, very important, very obvious things picked up? You made comments earlier on about the fairness of the charge, and we're looking at going to a per car charge, etc., and that sounds quite sensible. What was wrong with the consultation that it didn't pick these things up?
We have to recognise that there was an impact assessment, so all relevant points will have been considered, and this is something which we've actually been challenged in court. So it has been considered, the approach that we actually took and what was considered when we made those decisions. And it was found that we'd taken the right approach and it was fully appropriate.
I suppose that's a matter of perspective. I find it quite hard to suggest you took the right approach, considering the huge costs and what the industry referred to as disproportionate effects. So the much larger operators being fined and being able to absorb it, and the smaller ones being completely wiped out. So I don't quite see how that consultation was of any merit at all. But I'm going to stop there because the chair is under pressure for time.
Thanks. Flo.
You mentioned that we have over 1,000 applicants for PHV licence every week. Why has there been an increase of drivers but yet a decrease in operators?
Operators?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't be able to point to exactly why there's been a decrease in operators. That's not something that we carry out specific studies on. However, there has been a decline in the number of operators since 2012. I could only say that that's probably an element of consolidation, an element of natural churn within the industry.
One of the things that I was going to ask earlier, but we ran out of time, but it might be good to put to you, is if any impact has been taken by TfL in terms of the future of the cars on our road. So we're a long way away from it yet, but in terms of looking at driverless cars and what impact that would have.
On driverless cars?
Yeah.
I haven't got any information about driverless cars. I think we recognise that that's something in the future and will require a lot of work to understand what the impact of that is, but that's at very early stages.
Okay, yeah, we'll stick to this. We're now going on to the English language test. Before Sean asks these questions, do we have any pronouncement?
Yes, so I'm tempted to shout across the gallery. We have made an announcement today, or will be announcing it today, that we are extending the transitional arrangements to September 2020. And as the point was made today, that does link to the government recommendations that there should be a national English language standard. We want to work with the Department for Transport about what their guidance and policy will be on that to make sure that we're fully aligned. We do want to work with them to influence what approach is actually taken and make sure that we don't want to do something that isn't in line with that would have to change again in the future. So that gives us time to make sure that happens.
Okay, I'm going to pass to Sean. What a happy coincidence. It happened to be just as this meeting started. Sean.
I was thinking the same thing. Obviously renders many of these questions moot at this point. But why the change now? Because the situation with the government has been around for some time. So why have you...
The recommendations for the Task and Finish group was, I think that was published in September. We have been waiting to understand whether the government was going to approve all of those recommendations. That only came out in February, I think. So, but we have been in that time considering if there are any changes that we could take to the approach we've taken for English language. We recognise that the trade have talked to us about some difficulties of it being more onerous, and that's something that we have been considering. However, we don't want to do something that's not in line with the government recommendations, so we feel that it is appropriate to extend that.
So will you be pursuing the same sort of English language test? Will you be pursuing the government to set their standard at the same place that TfL was going to?
Well, again, this is something that we were challenged in court. We believe that the B1 standard is the correct level for a private hire driver. It might be the mechanism that's actually proven by private hire drivers is something that could change. But again, it's something that we want to talk to the DFT about and what their thoughts are. And that conversation is happening over the remainder of the year.
But of course, the DFT are going to ask you what your opinions are and why you had set out in the manner you set out. Because of course, many drivers were, I suppose, horrified by the test they'd have to go through. It's seen as inappropriate for the job that they do on a day-to-day basis. When you're sat with the DFT, surely it would be reasonable for a driver to expect you to pursue the DFT to do what you were going to do anyway. I mean, the DFT may say no, but what will be your start point? What will you be asking them to do?
We are confident that the B1 level on reading, writing, speaking and listening is the correct level for a private hire driver for the reasons that we set out in the original consultation and all of the documentation we have when we introduced it. We will speak to the DFT about that, but that would be our starting point.
So if the DFT was to listen to you, it would stay the way it's going to be, or just be implemented later. So have you taken into account the fact that many people in the industry think it will negatively impact, particularly the older members of their workforce who don't have the paperwork, who have entered that industry because of they don't have to, write literary pieces on a piece of paper? Have you taken into account the impact it will have on those people who will then find it harder to seek employment because of their age?
So when we're looking at the level, as I say, for the reasons originally given that we think it is the correct level, I think there is an opportunity for us to look at whether we can make it less onerous on people to prove that they have that level, taking into the points that were made about difficulties in passing the test, providing the evidence to us. And it is, some of the evidence provided is quite challenging to verify. So, as I said previously, we are looking to see if there are changes we can make to make it less onerous. And that might be just that it takes less time to sit a test, it might be less costly, and that's something we actively want to look at to see if we can make it easier for a driver on ensuring that they show that they have the level rather than changing the level.
Okay, but it's still, the basic premise is, how will the test be administered? It won't be significantly different in your mind. Now, many of the drivers are upset about having to sit around and write this test in a particular way. The cost is a separate thing. That, of course, that's going to be a problem for people. But people are concerned about the actual nature of the test, and they're saying it bears no resemblance whatsoever, no relevance to the job that they perform on a day-to-day basis. It isn't helping people's safety. All it's doing is according to some figures, removing anything from 15 to 20,000 people from that workforce. Mm-hmm. So you're happy to pursue the test in the way you've laid out already and leave it like that, even though people are worried that it's going to remove 15,000 to 20,000 people from that workforce?
So we have had conversations with our colleagues in the trade, and they've highlighted some of the points that you're making there about whether there's a need for a more bespoke test, a simpler test, and that is something that we have been thinking about, and it is something that we're considering, and it could be that we could find a less onerous test and that is more relevant to the trade, and we are actively looking at that.
Okay, so there is some chance that you will pursue a different direction on the test?
It is something that we're actively looking to make sure that there is a test that is easier for the drivers to pass.
I think the drivers would want something that's more appropriate, not just easier.
Well, yeah, different words. Appropriate is the right word to use, yes. And we will engage with the trade to discuss that and to get their input into how that could work.
Have you any time scale for that? Because now you've kicked it into the long grass.
Well, that's something that we're not going to stop looking at. It's something that we'll be looking at over the year.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to bring a couple of colleagues in, but can I ask, please, that you do consult with Sue Floor, who's Head of Policy for the British Dyslexia Association. We heard from her earlier, and we all welcome you looking at the test being far more appropriate. Flo.
Just on that, one of the things that we would like to see is actually the B1 English test being incorporated into the current topographical test, which would make life a lot easier for the drivers. It wouldn't burden them with any additional costs, but would still get that level of English. Is that something that you'll be looking at now that this has been extended into 2020?
I think the topographical test as it currently stands, it will be quite difficult to derive an English language standard from it.
Why is that?
Because it's more of a map reading test with a multiple choice
But
answers.
this could be an additional feature in the current test.
So I think what we are looking at and alluding to when we're looking at a more bespoke test could be that there could be additional modules that are added to that are more specific to the work of a private hire driver, understanding the legislation that they need to adhere to and their rights and obligations. With an expanded test, that might be possible. With it as it currently is, we don't think we could do that. But we want to work with the experts in the English language industry to understand whether that's feasible. We don't have the expertise ourselves within TfL, but we believe that we could work with the experts in the wider industry to see if that's feasible. So I think the answer is yes, that's something that we will actively look at.
Andrew.
Just a quick one. You talked about the government recommendations. Did they make any recommendations about the level of English that should be required? Have you said what you think it should be?
From memory, I think they said that would be something that would be set by the licensing authority. But I think having those conversations with the DFT and look for consistency across the nation is what we would like to do.
Okay, I think as speedily as you can to give some comfort to these drivers who are really very, very concerned about this. Right, we're going on to congestion charge exemption now, Caroline.
Yes. So we heard earlier from Christina about the Mayor's transport strategy, the objective to get more people walking, cycling and using public transport. So the removal of the congestion charge exemption is presumably the purpose of it is to drive down demand for road space in the centre. Now, how do you think that is going to be apportioned between? Is it going to be the drivers or the operators? And are you looking to a future with maybe a different kind of congestion charge where you might actually be able to, if it was a per mile charge, where it could actually be apportioned directly to the passenger who would be the person who was driving the demand, so it would actually kind of, you know, have its demand management impact in a more direct way. So I just wonder if you could...
Yeah, briefly to recap on what I was saying earlier about how we've looked at how the costs might be apportioned. So operators who will accept those kind of fares that go into the zone and may incur a charge will be able to choose how they manage that additional business cost, which may be either spreading the cost between operators, drivers and passengers, and likely we think are spread across all three, and we're already seeing some operators explaining that is how they'll manage that cost. So there will be some impact on the end user. And the expected reduction in demand is, the expected reduction in traffic is from a demand reduction. With regard to future forms of road user charging, there is a policy in the Mayor's transport strategy that we will think about what those future more sophisticated forms of road user charging will be. But I don't have anything more to say on that now.
Okay. And in the consultation paper to the Mayor, you called the disproportionate impact on BAME drivers a minor adverse one. Is that something you still agree with?
So again, I'm conscious that I don't want to talk too much about this.
Of course.
But if I could just explain that the way the methodology for the integrated impact assessment works is that it's a kind of standard industry methodology, and the minor adverse refers essentially to the scale and distribution. So it's the fact that the majority of PHV drivers do not enter the congestion charging zone during charging hours. So it would only be a third of drivers who would be affected by this. And that as a kind of macro, it's looking at the scale and distribution of that impact, okay, so it's of the policy as a whole.
It's
not about the impact on how that would feel on an individual basis.
Okay, and I assume that yes, we can't ask any more.
Obviously, if it strays, we've got to be very careful.
I don't think I get to say more than that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody on that? No.
Can I just ask
yes,
just a small one. You were asking earlier on about the impact of the night tube, and one of the points that came out was the fact that the last mile concept that we've applied to freight at TfL sort of also applies where the night tube finishes, and so it's created some new work for taxi drivers, perhaps. At stations, and they were saying taxi cabs, not so much, more for PHV drivers, where the night tube terminates. The opposite of that, obviously, is given the introduction of the night tube is now running in the centre of town, where a lot of the lines are. Are you aware that there's been a decline in the use of private hire vehicles and potentially taxis in the centre of town?
Specifically at night?
Yes, but as a result of the night tube. which runs at night, I believe. I've heard.
Yes, no, sorry, I just wanted to check that we were answering the right question.
Yes, that's why I'm narrowing it down to when the night tube is running.
I'm not aware of any particular studies about where the work is occurring. If there is anything, I'll find out and come back to you. But
I think it would be very helpful for us because we're looking at the economy committee, so we're looking at the economic impacts of, all the different changes that are coming through. And I think for me to hear that there might be more opportunities because the night tube is running at the ends of the line or where people are, coming out of the centre of town, I would like to know if there's been an economic impact on the minicab firms, which is what we're looking at today, because the night tube is running, but perhaps in the other direction in the centre of town. So if you have some information on that, I'd be very interested to see that. Thank you.
Okay. With regard to the removal of the congestion charge exemption, TfL's own report indicates that the larger operators would only have to increase their fares by about 2% to compensate, but the smaller ones would have to increase their fares by 16%. So does that sound reasonable to you?
I'd rather not go into the details of discussing individual impacts, I think, given the status of the legal challenge.
That's a shame, really, because that's.
I think. I
said this earlier on.
I know.
I can talk a bit about the proportion of small operators that are in the zone.
Then we understand.
So I think what we can say is explain maybe is that the smaller operators make up about a fifth of the PHV trips into the zone. So that's the operators with 100 vehicles or fewer. For the very small operators, so those with 1 to 10 vehicles, they account for about 3% of PHV trips in the congestion charging zone, and 11 to 20 about 4%.
Okay, well, as we can't press on that, which is a shame, but I do understand. Leonie's going to ask questions about the ULEZ.
Yes, which is obviously starting on the 8th of April. How many private hire vehicle drivers are you anticipating that the ultra-low emission zone from the 8th of April will actually impact?
So currently about 70% of the PHV fleet is ULEZ compliant. So we would expect that number to increase between now and April. But
sorry, so already 70%
already
of the fleet.
70%, and the majority of PHV trips don't enter the ULEZ either. So again,
most trips don't come into the central congestion charging zone area where the ULEZ is launching?
Yes.
Okay. When you say most, are we talking 51% because that's most, or higher?
I don't have the exact number on me. I know I don't have that exact number on me. I can come back with that, but
are
the majority
you able to provide that figure?
I'll take that back and find out.
I think that would be really helpful because obviously most is, or it could be 50.1%, which is also most, obviously.
Yes.
Small results in these things do actually
matter.
So
I agree.
If it's just very marginally most, or if it's 85%, that makes quite a substantial difference.
So during congestion charging hours, it's a third of drivers. For ULEZ, it will be a different number, so I'd want to come back on that.
Because the ULEZ is obviously 24/7, 365, so that would be helpful to know.
Yeah.
So, so bearing in mind you haven't been able to answer that, what I'm looking to find out from you is what do you think the impact of the introduction of the 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year ultra-low emission zone is going to be on the PHV industry?
So again, just to recap what the vehicle standards are. So we're talking about a Euro 6 standard for diesels, which is a diesel vehicle which is now
I know
about
what the
6 years
standards
old.
are. I'm asking about the impact. You've told us that you think that 70% of vehicles are compliant, but there's obviously still 30%, which is quite a sizable number. So there is going to be an impact, and I know what the standards are for the ULEZ. Thank you.
Sorry. So for the 70% that are compliant, operators, particularly the larger operators, will be able to specialise their vehicles to an extent. So use the 70% compliant vehicles to serve the trips that are in that particular geographical area. We also expect that figure to go up prior to April as operators and businesses continue to prepare for the introduction of the ULEZ. So we expect that number will go up. But we do acknowledge that there will be a small, minor impact for some operators.
So you're expecting it to go up more by the time of the launch?
Yes.
So do the private hire vehicle drivers who own their own vehicles, but who then use them on a self-employed basis, are they eligible to apply for scrappage?
So the scrappage scheme that's been launched recently is a van scrappage scheme, so that doesn't apply to private hire vehicles.
So scrappage, no. And so what about, they've got no access to any kind of scrappage at all?
No.
Okay. Do you think that's a sensible choice? Do you think perhaps that this industry, given that it is there and it's part of the makeup, and you can argue very strongly that moving people into private hire vehicles, like persuading them to join car clubs, moves them away from single personal vehicle ownership, which is, I think, has to be part of the Mayor's transport strategy, even though we talk in terms of 80% of journeys not being made other than on foot, by bicycle, public transport. But in one sense, don't you think that the private hire vehicle industry is part of public transport in London?
So I think the role it has to play, exactly as you've described in terms of helping move away from private car ownership, is definitely an important part of how you get to a more sustainable city-wide kind of mode share and a way of moving around. Again, when we're talking about that very small central London area, that is one of the most highly accessible parts of the world, and actually there is a question about, do we want that to be heavily dominated by motor vehicles, and I don't think that we do. The ULEZ, the standards are there and they apply to everybody, because I think, as as I said before, we all have to play our part. This is a really significant air quality crisis which affects the health of Londoners.
I mean, I agree with all of that, and until very recently I was the chair of the Environment Committee, and I'm now the deputy chair, and Caroline is the chair. So we've had a lot to say to the deputy mayor for Environment about the fact that the Environment Committee has said that we're pleased that the commencement date of the ultra-low emission zone has been brought forward. We think 4 years from the announcement by the previous mayor in 2015 is long enough for people to comply. But you're still saying that there's 30%. So you're saying that the larger operators will then target trips into the central zone with the 70% of vehicles that do comply, which sounds good to me, and you're also saying you think that's going to come up more. Have you got any evidence for this? Can you just tell me maybe what impact has the launch of the T charge, the toxicity charge in October 2017? Is there any evidence from that launch that driver or owner or company behaviour has changed?
So I don't have that kind of specific breakdown with me. I think the T charge, because it applied to the very oldest vehicles, I'd have to check, but there were probably fewer kind of private hire vehicles that would have applied to, but I will go back and check that.
Yes, I think that would be really helpful, because I think we do have a concern about this sector, which is why we're talking about it in this committee. Just as in parallel, we have this fairly serious concern about 9,000 Londoners who are dying. And of course, that leaves to one side the children whose lungs are affected, and also people who suffer from, extensive bouts of COPD. That's very difficult for them. So, is there any help from the mayor at all to help operators make their vehicle fleets, where they do own them, any more environmentally friendly?
I think we've set the standards at where we think is the right level, which is a tough standard, but as we said, there are a multitude of vehicles which are available at Euro 6 and Euro 4, which is why then it's not a tighter standard than that, to ensure that people are able to meet the standard, and it does apply to everybody.
Okay, but
there is no specific
there's no help
for this.
There's no help.
Okay, but there's literally no help at all. Just at the time, of course, when we were exploring earlier about the introduction of a much higher licence fee, and of course exemption from the congestion charge has gone. So it's in a difficult context, I think you might agree.
Yeah, I think it is, but I think that's why the public health crisis is what's absolutely driving this. It's too important to ignore. We can't just stand by and watch it happen. So we do all have to just play a part. We've had to do a lot with our own buses in order to make that happen.
So let's look at that reverse side. London is estimated to be the 6th most congested city in the whole of the world. We've heard that other cities are completely banning diesel by 2025. For example, Madrid, Mexico City, and places actually in Mexico City would probably be fairly irrelevant, because the jams in Mexico City are mostly caused by non-diesel vehicles. So in that sense, the fact that the centre of town is so congested at the moment must have a negative impact on private hire vehicle companies and individual drivers, and it's estimated that it costs drivers almost £2,000 a year in lost time. Do you think the ULEZ is going to assist PHV companies and also the drivers?
So obviously the objective of ULEZ is not to reduce congestion. The congestion charge changes are obviously intended to do that.
Well, it's intended to reduce congestion in the sense that the combination of ULEZ and congestion is to both reduce congestion and also reduce the noxious fumes in our air.
Well, so the objective of the ultra low emission zone is to make sure that vehicles meet that emissions standard. So that's to clean up. That's an air quality objective. The congestion objective is met by the congestion charge, and so that's why those two schemes apply in that central London area. And of course, PHV drivers and operators will benefit from any reductions in congestion as a result of the congestion charge.
But as a side impact, it may help with congestion, and it therefore may benefit the drivers, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, it might help in that sort of sense. Now, obviously, a question that has now started being raised with us as Assembly members, and I'm sure this is common to all of us here and the other 19 Assembly members who aren't, is the issue of TfL's current state of finance and the fact that the ultra-low emission zone is projected to be raising a net operating surplus within its first year of potentially up to £127 million. Perhaps another side benefit, because obviously it's not being implemented to raise money. Can you confirm whether or not you think that figure is a fair figure? And also, could you give us some idea of what you're planning to spend this money on? Because my understanding is that it would then be targeted just as where people pay their money to park in a CPZ, or if they get a parking ticket, it goes to a council, it has to go into the highways budget. My understanding is that it will go into further air quality improvements. What sort of thing did you have in mind? Is that figure correct? And what would you be doing with that money, if any does come in as a net surplus?
I think, first of all, I think it's really important to reiterate, as you said, the objective of the ULEZ is not to raise money. The ULEZ is successful when vehicles meet those standards, they comply and they don't incur a charge. So that's absolutely what the objective of ULEZ is. Any surplus that is made will be going back into ensuring that we can plough money back into meeting the objectives of the Mayor's transport strategy, and particularly those air quality objectives. I don't have a list of things that it will fund.
Well, I mean, we've heard about lots of things: livable neighbourhoods, zero emission zones, zero emission neighbourhoods, public realm improvements, that sort of thing. Maybe even putting in some more rapid charging points for people to plug onto, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
indeed.
Are you
able to send us a list of the kind of things it might be spent on?
So I think you're absolutely right. What we'll go back into is the kind of TfL programme, which will help us meet those objectives. That will be into the policies that help support sustainable travel, be that walking and cycling and public realm infrastructure, exactly livable neighbourhoods, the zero emission zones. We're looking at local zero emission zones and something in central London in 2025. So we're exactly thinking about what will need to be done to make sure all of those things, and that money will be put back into those kind of public realm, public transport improvements.
I think it's really important that you're able to provide a full list of the kind of things that the money would be spent on, because I have to say I had a slight ripple of laughter there, when I said something previously. I think a lot of people do feel quite sceptical that this is just a money-making scheme to plug a hole in TfL's finances. And I think if you're asking people to pay this money, and you're saying it's going to go into this kind of scheme to improve air quality in London, and I did just re-emphasise that I am completely committed to this happening. I think we need to have a full list, what's at the top of the list, you know, what's at the bottom of the list, and also some kind of estimate of how much money you think is going to come in from this. You know, is electric vehicle charging points going to be at the top and providing more cycle routes at the bottom, or is it the other way around? I think it's really important that you are able to tell this committee and the rest of the Assembly, you know, what that kind of situation is. Can I just ask you about DEFRA, and I've just two more points, sorry Chair. DEFRA have estimated that poor air quality costs the economy as a whole 2.7 billion through its impact on individual productivity. So the people who are not dying but are taking days off work because they're breathless and because they're struggling. Have you included any kind of assessment of the benefit of the ULEZ in terms of the wider London economy, because we've reduced the number of sickness days that people are taking off work?
I will refer back to the IIA to see exactly what's included in there. I won't want to give you the wrong answer, but there will have been a full environmental and economic impact assessment.
And you're able to provide that?
Yeah, we can go
back
so
and
you'll be able to
send that. And then finally, what have you learnt about how to run a consultation from the implementation of all of these changes? We heard some comments earlier on about people were saying, I bought a Euro 5 compliant diesel only 2 years ago. Apparently hadn't noticed that the previous mayor had said in 2015 ultra low emission zone. You know, people complaining that the date of launch has come forward. Do you really feel that you've gone out of your way to really get the information out there sufficiently to all the private hire vehicle operators and also the drivers?
So if I use the congestion charging consultation, which has obviously been a recent one, as a kind of example. So the 2016 Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan raised concerns about the numbers of PHVs and their impact on congestion. And there have been a number of studies in 2017, Centre for London, Integrated Transport Planning, both did congestion reports in London, which suggested the removal of the PHV exemption and a review of the congestion charge. That was then included in the Mayor's transport strategy. In terms of highlighting the issue with the rising numbers of PHVs in the zone and a policy to keep the congestion charge under review. And the Mayor's signalled his intention to review that through a number of Mayor's questions. We asked Cambridge Economic Policy Associates to undertake an assessment of the impact on the trade. They did engagement with the trade in 2016 on this question and in 2018. And following that, once we decided to take the proposals forward to consultation, we also did an integrated impact assessment, which again worked with the trade to inform the economic equality business impacts of the change. So the trade have been engaged throughout all those kind of rounds of consultation. Then for consultation itself, we ran a 12-week public consultation. We emailed 195,000 private hire drivers, 1,200 stakeholders, 155,000 members of the public. There was a lot of press and media publication of it. We had a hugely high response, so more than 10,000 responses. In our report to the Mayor, we went through each issue raised individually and gave it an individual response so that it could be absolutely clear how we had responded to each of the issues raised. So I think in terms of consultation, we made every effort to engage with the trade along the way to make sure that we had a good response from a wide response to people, and we had a 55% support on that consultation. I would also just say we're members of the Consultation Institute, which is a well-established kind of best practice organisation, and we work with them and undertake annual training with them to ensure that we are continually kind of keeping up with best practice in that area.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sean, briefly.
Just very short thing. I wonder if I could see TfL's figures about the impact that the PSV trade is having on increased traffic in London. I'd like to see those figures, because the Londoners buy less cars, certainly young people. I want to see if there's a relationship between the prevalence of PSV and the reduction in cars that young Londoners buy.
We can see what we can provide.
I'd appreciate that.
On a London-wide basis?
Yes, I mean, it'd be great if you could zone it, because the centre is obviously where most of the traffic is, so that would make it much more useful, because obviously if you're zones 4, 5 and 6, driving is more of a necessity than if you're 3, 2, 1. So I'd like to understand, is PSV replacing car ownership? PHV, sorry. Is it replacing car ownership, or is it just adding to the traffic in London?
So in the congestion charging zone during charging hours, we saw in 2003 when the charge went in, there was a 15% drop in traffic, and that's remained fairly stable. So that drop in traffic has not been commensurate with a much more recent rise in PHVs. They've not kind of gone hand in hand.
But in that same,
in the congestion charging
zone.
zone.
The CEPA report on the TfL consultation on the congestion charge removal, it states that there will only be a 1% reduction in congestion in the zone in that report. So we as a group queried some of the data that was being used, but that's for another discussion. But just to state that that's what was said in the consultation document sent out by TfL.
Yeah, but yes, I don't. Is it? That's also true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, clarification would be great. Let's just see those figures. It'd be interesting.
Okay, one query. Euro 6 is allowed. Is that for black cabs as well as minicabs?
Or the ultra low emission zone.
Yeah.
So black cabs aren't included in the ultra low emission zone, but all new licensed taxis as of the beginning of this year had to be zero emission capable.
Okay, fine. You said that there are vehicles available for everything. I've heard from several people that there's no green vehicle available at the high end. I think it's
carriers.
7-seaters. There isn't anything available there.
A ULEZ compliant vehicle?
Yes.
Okay, we'll take that away.
Can you look at that, please? Just to summarise, I'm very pleased that you're looking at this language test, and I would urge you to bring that forward as far as you can and actually talk to those that are involved. The licensing schemes, you said, Graham, that you're looking for a fairer solution. I wish that a fairer solution had been found before we'd set it out. So I hope that that's dealt with and looked at.
Yeah, just to clarify, what we were looking at is what more could be done on the licence fee structure, and if there are ways that we can improve it.
Well, I hope that's brought forward quickly, because you did mention seasonal things. At Christmas, lots of the companies take on lots more people. Well, they're not going to be able to now, because it will put them into a different licensing group. You're going to look at electric points and Abu. Don't even look at the scrappage scheme, because there isn't one. You were completely correct about that. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our two guests for your contribution. Can we note the discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as chairman to agree an appropriate output from this meeting? Thank you.
Consultation with party
leads. Of course.
And
Shame I can't do it on my own, but yes, of course, in consultation. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme report and agree to use the 3rd of April 2019 meeting slot to discuss the ethnicity pay gap? The response of London and Partners Transparency Policy Consultation attached at Appendix 1 to the report, and the report impact review of the committee's report, What Works for Micro-Businesses, attached as Appendix 2 to the report. The next meeting of this committee is scheduled for the 3rd of April 2019 at 10 a.m. in Committee Room 2, City Hall. No other business has been advised, so I formally close the meeting.
Thank you.